Hi, I'm Robert Rose, Curator Emeritus at Miami Seaquarium. Today we're here with Lolita, also known as Tokitae, or Toki for short.
Hi, Robert. Why don't we tell the people what Tokitae's situation is really like at the Miami Seaquarium?
This is an extreme case of torture and abuse.
She's fed poor quality rotten food. The water in her tank is dirty, and her trainers disregarded veterinary instructions.
There's 2 umbrellas for the trainers that are working with her, but yet there's no shade for her.
When you are close to her, you can feel the sadness that she's just hanging on.
Tokitae's story begins 57 years ago. She was born in 1967 to Elpod, one of the 3 southern resident orca pods that live along the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. This population is extremely limited, with only 76 individuals left, so her birth was a blessing. Unfortunately, 1967 was also the year that capturing orcas for public display was gaining popularity. Just 3 short years after her birth, a massive whale capture was undertaken in Tokitae's home waters off the coast of Whidbey Island in Washington state. On this infamous day in Penn Cove, business partners Ted Griffin and Don Goldsberry rounded up over 80 orcas and sold 7 into captivity. Tokitae was one of these 7. And to show you the kinds of men that these were, here's an actual quote from Don Goldsberry recounting that day.
So we split open their stomachs, put anchors on them, and sunk them because no one else would take them.
As a child of just 3 years old, Tokitae was now being ripped from her family and her home to be taken to the Miami Seaquarium, where she would live for the next 50 years.
You know what? I'm over being sad. It's time to get mad.
She was doomed to live half of a century here in the smallest tank in all of North America. Some even argue the smallest tank in the whole world. The tank is so small that it's been nicknamed the Whale Bowl. And to give you some perspective on just how small Toki's tank was, let's get into the numbers. Toki herself was 22-foot long orca, or 6.5 meters. Her tank was a mere 80 feet or 24 meters long, not even 4 times the length of her own body. Oh, and it gets worse. Her tank was only 35 feet wide. And remember, she's 22 feet, so that's not even double her body length. To know what this feels like, imagine being trapped in your bedroom for the rest of your life. We had a taste of that during COVID, and we did not handle it well. As an understatement. So imagine doing that for the rest of your life. Imagine 2020 is the rest of your life. And still it gets worse. When you compare the size of Tokitae's tank to the distance that she would be swimming as a wild orca every day, she would have to swim 1,126 laps every day. And this is made even more awful when you learn that the Whale Bowl, her tank, was newly constructed. This wasn't some supplemental solution the Miami Seaquarium was working with. They knew that they were bringing in an orca, and this was the size of the tank that they thought was acceptable to build. Let that sink in. The size of the tank was a choice. And yes, it still continues to get worse. The depth of her tank was abysmal. Remember, Tokitae, 22 feet long. Her depth of her tank was 20 feet long. She couldn't even dive all the way under. She couldn't submerge herself in her own tank. And that was at the deepest point. The deepest point of her tank was 20 feet deep. Everywhere else was 13 feet deep. So unlike orcas in the wild that are diving hundreds of feet multiple times, Tokitae for over 50 years couldn't even sink her whole body underwater.
A marine mammal.
And even though these dimensions are against those legally required by the Animal Welfare Act, and although numerous infractions have been cited in multiple USDA inspection reports, nothing was ever done for 50 years. But Tokitae's tiny tank was just the start of the emotional and physical challenges that she would face in her life at the Miami Seaquarium. This small tank wasn't just home to one orca, it was home to two. When Tokitae arrived at the Seaquarium, she was almost immediately introduced to Hugo, another orca captured from the Puget Sound just 2 years earlier. The two lived together in that tiny tank for 10 years. And on top of that, they were made to perform 4 to 6 shows per day, every single day, 365 days a year for those 10 years. While cohabitating in such a small space, Tokitae was impregnated a few times, but she never delivered a live offspring. Interestingly, no matter how hard I researched, I couldn't find any more information on Tokitae's pregnancies or births. But we know the orca's brain is much larger and much more complex than our own. So I can't imagine that losing those pregnancies didn't have some kind of dramatic, lasting emotional impact on her. Tokitae and Hugo formed a bond. They were both from the southern resident Orca clan, so they had similarities in language and culture. But Hugo wasn't like Tokitae. He was aggressive. From the moment Hugo was brought to the Miami Seaquarium, he made it clear that he was not willing to adjust to his life in captivity.
He had a history of aggression towards his trainers and committing harmful acts against himself. He became known for repeatedly bashing his head against the viewing windows of his tank, one time smashing his head so hard that he cut off the tip of his nose. It required stitches to get reattached.
And still, nothing was ever done to improve Tokitae and Hugo's living conditions.
In March 1980, Hugo passed away. He suffered a brain aneurysm as a direct result of him smashing his head against his tank.
Hugo had taken his own life, and Tokitae was a witness. And what did the Miami Seaquarium do after this tragic event? How did they treat Tokitae? They made her perform the very next day.
The lack of consideration is sickeningly clear in this excerpt from the Tampa Tribune in 1981. They described her as a, quote, happy widow, which is just sick in itself. But then it goes on to say, and this is, again, a direct quote from Lou Roth, her 23-year-old head trainer at the time, that they, quote, expected problems when Hugo unalived, but Lolita performed as usual the next day. Once in a while she would look for him, but she got over it.
She got over it. Jess, I know you witnessed your best friend of 10 years unalive himself, but you'll get over it. So you might be asking yourself, who is Lolita? I thought we were talking about an orca named Tokitae. Well, surprise, surprise, that is another awful, depressing, horrid story for you. Her first veterinarian at the Miami Seaquarium named her Tokitae as an attempt to honor her heritage.
Roughly translated, Tokitae means nice day, pretty colors in the Chinook language, a coastal Salish tribe who inhabit the region where she was captured.
However, around this same time, the Miami Seaquarium was undergoing a rebrand. From a quote by Jesse White, the Miami Seaquarium veterinarian who oversaw her capture and transport, the MSQ was trying to, quote, market itself as a destination with subtle sex appeal. So I guess Tokitae wasn't sexy enough for the Miami Seaquarium, and they changed her name to Lolita. And just like her tank, it gets worse. This wasn't just a fun Latin name that they chose at random. Lolita was chosen based on the Vladimir Nabokov novel of the same name, and I kid you not, is about a full-grown man who becomes so obsessed with a 12-year-old girl. Let me repeat that again. A 12-year-old girl that he kidnaps and essays her and then changes her name to Lolita as a sign of possession. And that is real. Like the Miami Seaquarium chose that reference. If that's not the most disgusting parallel the Miami Seaquarium could have chosen for Tokitae, I genuinely don't know what is. And all of this is just the beginning of Tokitae's story. We're just scratching the surface. Because there's so much to say, there's going to be 3 more parts, with the next one focusing more on the dirty, dangerous, and downright unethical living conditions that Tokitae had to face in her, again, 50 plus years in the Miami Seaquarium. So yeah, if you thought this video was bad, you might want to have some tissues handy or some pitchforks. Tokitae's story deserves to be heard by as many people as possible. So the more people I can tell it to, the better. So as every cheesy cliche YouTuber, it really would mean a lot if you subscribed, if you shared, if you liked the video, because we need to get her story out there. More people need to know what this orca went through. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and I am sending you all of the orca love.